Welcome, everyone, to the Jake Dunlap Show. This is your weekly dose of real success stories from entrepreneurs, athletes, celebrities, CEOs, and the people that you love. If you've ever wondered what makes people tick, what are the weird things that happened to them in their past that help to shape the people that they've became, every Thursday at 8 a.m. Eastern, you can tune in and get exactly that. The behind the scenes, not the typical behind the scenes, but the real stories that shaped some of the people that you know, love, and follow. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. Today's episode is going to be a interesting, entertaining, and hopefully you're going to walk away learning something, and also researching yourself and looking into yourself from a resilient standpoint as well too. In every person's life, there are challenges that sometimes seem impossible to get through. But however pain or struggles might be and how tough they might be, when we overcome them, we always become stronger and better prepared for whatever life throws our way. Today's guest is an example of resilience and someone who's been a champion for the internet and privacy and advertising for quite some time. But after losing his wife 2 years ago, he noticed that he was still seeing advertising and still being inundated with research for cancer studies and other treatments, which in his mind just didn't sit right. This gentleman has a degree from Northwestern, MBA from Harvard Business School, and really has been at the forefront of kind of like, as we talked about in the pre-show, the rise in privacy and the rise of invasion of privacy in our lives over the last 10 plus years. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Frechtling. Dan, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Jake. Great to be here. I've enjoyed some of your prior episodes and pleased to be here.
That's good. I always like it when people say that. Whether they've actually listened or not is fine. It's like, at least they've told me that they do. It makes me feel good, Yeah. Listen at 3x speed, whatever works for you. But no, I'm really looking forward to this. And again, I think there's just, again, so many different ways that we can take this. It was really fascinating what we were starting to dive into in the kind of pre-conversation as well. So I want to make sure we do spend some time on kind of the history of this, because I know myself included have like a basic idea of some of this, but certainly not your level of experience. So as usual, we like to go back. You grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. And spent a lot of your early childhood there. So what are some kind of early memories you have around, whether it's business or entrepreneurship that really stuck out to you?
Well, I was into everything when I was a kid, and it was, the idyllic place to grow up. We had kids in the neighborhood. We were always up to something, usually good things. But as I got older, and with anything in life, you got to narrow down what you do. I got really intrigued by journalism. And growing up in the DC area, there was always a lot of news happening.
Sure.
And so that was where I kind of focused my end of my high school years. So some of the memories, there were some tough situations, actually. I was editor of the high school paper, and there was a situation where one former student shot and killed another former student. And it was a really tragic situation, but the law enforcement was kind of running around in circles trying to figure out what had happened. And just by blind luck, because I happened to know both of them, it was actually a postman murder where one showed up pretending to deliver mail on the 4th of July and ended up shooting his target. But because they were connected in high school, I ended up writing an article that made that connection, and it was really one of those odd situations. So being a journalist early on, you kind of learn to investigate, kind of learn to look under the hood, and sometimes things like that just kind of happen, and things fall in your lap as well. But that was memories of my upbringing were a lot of running around and playing football in the backyard with my friends, and some more high stakes situations as a journalist.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot early. I had the same. I think I've told this story before. I had a similar upbringing in Missouri where my parents literally, and this sounds crazy now, they would lock the door on the weekend. It would be like at 10 a.m. It's like, you're out of the house. You're going, you figure it out. That was kind of it. It's like, you'll figure it out. Then you come home or you don't, then they're fine. So what made you lead to go to Northwestern? I mean, obviously, look, journalism and also economics, were kind of two passions of yours. Obviously, early, as you mentioned in high school, you had this kind of passion for journalism, and obviously, writing some very serious stuff for a high school, paper of sorts. So, what was it that got you into, why Northwestern and your experience there in both journalism and economics?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess at the end of my high school year, I won an award, which was the top student journalist in the Maryland, DC, Delaware area. And so I kind of felt locked into this journalism path.
Right.
Northwestern has a great journalism school called Medill. But I can tell you from the first day I showed up on campus, I realized that journalism school was not for me.
Right.
But what do you do, right? You're there, you're enrolled. So what do you do? So I stuck with the program, added economics because I was then getting more interested in business. And if you start to apply the principles of economics to the fundamentals of journalism, then you start to figure out that this was in the mid 90s, that the prospects for journalists in the following decades, the prognosis was not very good, economically speaking, right? And this was even before the internet, but one of the things that Medill did was they kind of forecast and foretold the rise of on-demand news and what that was going to do to create journalism, citizen journalists all over the place. So the commoditization of journalism was just starting to happen when I was there. I could see that from the economic standpoint. And so I ended up not going into journalism and doing something completely different when I graduated.
Yeah. And then what made you make the decision to go back and get your MBA? Like, what was it for you that you said, I mean, obviously, look, you graduated, and like a lot of people, you don't necessarily go into what you actually major in. But, look, you went to Northwestern, graduated with honors. What was the decision like then to say, hey, you know what? I want to go back and get my MBA?
I think it was two things. One was just the challenge of it, to have another run and to try to do something that I may or may not have been able to be successful at. The other thing was I was sick of working after 2 or 3 years. I want to get back on campus again. I mean, who wouldn't? Right?
There's the honest answer. It's like, I want to go back and do this. But you also, I mean, you spent some time in China, around then as well too, which in 95 was not, not nearly what it is today in terms of people visiting China. And so what was that experience like?
Yeah. So when I left the house, my parents didn't want to be empty nesters. So they ended up taking in a Chinese student. And he had an interesting story because his father was associated with the Communist Party. And after Tiananmen Square, he got out of the country because he felt he was at risk. There's various purges that have happened in time in China and still today, if you follow the news there. So he got out and he stayed with my family. And so I was out of school. I was out of home. I was at school, but I got to know him. And he, basically in the early 90s, he was saying, you should study Chinese. I bet you that's going to be a worthwhile skill for you. And I had some credits open at Northwestern. I started taking Chinese, and it opened up all kinds of opportunities from really 95 to 2000, taking trips out there. I worked for an investment firm. I met a lot of locals there, and it was while the country was still developing.
Right.
So
exactly.
It was still, it's different now. It was very, very open to foreigners and very curious about foreigners still. Because I went to school in Tianjin at Nankai Dashi, the university. So it was a good sort of life experience and learning and cultural experience, and all wrapped into one.
Yeah, it's like another one of those, like in your story of you kind of like digging in and kind of getting into to really understand the nuance of something. Like you mentioned some of like your journalism endeavors. Like where does that come from? Like where do you think? I mean, if you look at kind of this early childhood of like going the extra step, wanting to learn new things. Again, you have these experiences and different people you're exposed to in situations, but is that something that you feel like, is that like from your parents, or, where do you feel like that, I guess, like natural curiosity plus intensity, came from?
Yeah, I think it's innate. I think if you find the things that draw people into journalism, I would say, are some of the same things that draw people into sales. Because as a journalist, you get to create your own schedule, essentially. You figure out what are your prospects. And in the case of journalists, it's who's my news sources? Where's the news going to come from? And you craft a story around that and you publish it. And that thrill of publishing a story is quite like the thrill of closing a sale.
Yeah.
And that entrepreneurial existence in a professional kind of structure, I think makes being a journalist and being a salesperson very similar in that regard. And so it attracts some of the same people. So there's an entrepreneurial aspect to that is really addictive, and you can't really find in any other job.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I like have drawn that parallel, but it makes a ton of sense. Even, I mean, obviously, as someone who's built a career in sales, that the ability to really just get to the heart of like what's happening, get to the heart of like what's really happening here versus like a surface level answer. I could certainly see that. And so then look, so after you go back, you're back on campus, you're having some fun in Cambridge. What I guess it's like how did you end up in like we'll call it like the marketing world? So you've been from the journalism back and get your MBA at Harvard. Like what was it that kind of led you over the next 5 or 6 years to like DSIQ and maybe some of the roles before that?
Yeah. So the bridge from journalism into business was facilitated by a pit stop in public relations, where I worked on the Gatorade account, and I did just enough work on Gatorade that I was attractive to General Mills, and they hired me out of undergrad to run one of the Cheerios brands, Apple Cinnamon Cheerios at the time. That was a very classic, kind of marketing as general management kind of role, which also helped me on the path to business school. But that's where there's a storytelling, again, kind of to fall back into journalism, but there's a storytelling in journalism that's also reflected in marketing.
Yeah.
And when you think about messaging, when you think about persuasion, right, there's a lot around what's the nut, like what's going to be meaningful to the listener of whatever you're pitching, and how can you be creative in that regard? So that really got me kind of passionate about marketing and classic consumer marketing. And I stuck with that in business school. I graduated business school, and I was forced, they kicked me out of the campus at that point, so I couldn't avoid having a real job. But I jumped into consulting because I felt like consulting was a bit of a continuing education. So I worked for McKinsey for a few years, trying to do as much marketing projects as I could. And then from there, I got swept up in the first .com era, right around
Stamps.com, right? Wasn't it Stamps.com?
Yeah. And I did marketing, led marketing for Stamps.com. And so it just was sort of a recurring theme of the marketing as a kind of a core, but also being in general management around that.
Right. So it wasn't just marketing. There was like product ownership or like you said,
That's
GM
right.
type experience, which I think is interesting, right? I guess like in a lot of like consumer brands in particular, these things the identity of the company and the financials of the company can be so intertwined that it makes a ton of sense. And so like what got you away from that world? So you're in this so you're starting to build a career in this like B2C world, and again, working for some of these, both established brands, General Mills, and then the up and coming, the Stamps.coms of the world. I guess like how did you make the leap or decide to make the move over to, kind of out of just the pure, call it B2C world?
Yeah, it was kind of forced by environment. So we ended up in Seattle. And at the time, Seattle was more B2B than B2C. There were a few consumer brands like Starbucks, and it's changed since then. But Seattle was much more of an enterprise B2B type software technology.
Oh, yeah.
And so in order to have the most opportunity, I made a left turn and moved from B2C into B2B and really haven't looked back since then. And I would say B2B is a little bit more of an intellectual kind of fit with what I like, because you tend to be a little more superficial in B2C marketing because you have such short attention spans. But with B2B, you have the opportunity to craft differentiation and to position yourself and to put facts and case studies and evidence behind what you're saying. And so that was a kind of more intuitively appealing, which is where DSIQ was the first company I worked for. And then I've worked for others since in B2B marketing.
Yeah, it's interesting. What was your because I think a lot of people, and I'll throw myself out there. I mean, candidly, B2B marketing could also be kind of, boring at times. I'll just put it that way. What was your biggest takeaway? Like when you go from like that B2C side to B2B, where it is that, again, it doesn't have to be boring. Just a lot of it tends to be boring. What was your big learning? That leap from like, getting inside the minds of consumers for very specific demographics to then, again, like you said, having to put together more evidence-based marketing, or whatever that looked like. Like, do you remember some of your like big learnings or takeaways, or maybe even things from the B2C world that really prepared you to be exceptional on the B2B side?
Yeah, I used to think that B2C marketing was more scientific because you have such large numbers to deal with.
Right.
And the idea of just throwing things out there and running tests and A/B tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seeing what wins, and then champion, challenger, continuing to iterate around that. That was real scientific and remains scientific around B2C marketing. But B2B marketing is also scientific, but in sort of a different way, in that there's patterns, and you can see patterns even without the quantitative sort of numbers that you have in B2C marketing. Like, for example, the technology adoption life cycle, that idea of there being enthusiasts and early adopters that are going to be the first ones to try your product. And those are the ones that are going to allow you to throw something out there that's incomplete, that's a minimum viable product, and refine it with them. So then you can move to the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and kind of cross into that increasing penetration, which I've experienced more in B2B. You see it a little bit in B2C in the technology side, but I see that more in B2B. Another example is Jeffrey Moore's value proposition.
Crossing the chasm.
Yeah. So crossing the chasm is all about the technology adoption lifecycle, but he's also built this framework around messaging, around first, who are you for? Who is your product for? And what is the definition of that product? And then before you go too far about yourself, acknowledging your competition and how are you unlike, better than anything before you? And then closing with, you're the only company that can do X, Y, and Z. So that framework around messaging and a bit more of a experimental approach in the science side of B2B, I think, which was surprising to me, is just as true, but in a slightly different way than what I saw in B2C market.
I do feel like sometimes where I feel like B2B is slow is, B2C marketing, like you mentioned, it's the data sets are larger, quite a bit larger many times. But there's kind of this culture of like always optimizing, like you're always in like performance marketing mode. And I sometimes feel like in B2B, especially again, coming from the sales side, that, we're pumping hundreds or thousands of demos and things through the system as well too. But, they implement a new methodology every 3 years or 4 years. And it's like, we cannot continue to iterate at this pace. Like consumer behavior has spilled over so much into what people expect from an experience, where now it's like throwing up the same gates and hurdles and, download this if you give me these 8 pieces of data points. We're just seeing more and more marketers and sales organizations start to think a little bit more, I would call it, B2C or performance based, just because they have to. Because again, the buying cycles for our consumer life have just sped up so much that, and B2B buying is still very, qualification, and then this, and then this, and then this is our process. And I really do feel like B2B is in for a really big overhaul on the sales process in particular, as people are coming in with much higher levels of intent. So I don't know if that's something that you've seen as well too, but that's certainly something that's top of mind.
I do
for me.
agree. Yeah. Well, the other thing is that people are coming in with much more knowledge about your product or service from that first meeting, and they may be halfway through their buying decision before they've met you. So they're going to be quite educated. You got to be ready for that.
Yeah. Which I don't think many times we are. Instead, it's like, oh, here, I need to have a conversation and then I'll introduce you to somebody. It's like, no, that's not what's going to happen. You're going to get that person on the phone now because I've already talked to your 2 competitors and I already have pricing from them. So I don't need this whole, game of you qualify me, then I got to like search for pricing. I think there's a lot of good things that are going to come out of it. Let's put it that way. I think it's going to become a much more customer-centric approach versus sales methodology approach, which is I'm excited about. So let's get back to you. Enough about me and my opinions. So let's talk about this. So you're kind of coming up in these marketing roles with organizations that, are, heavily involved in, you were part of like Walmart Smart Network, and stamps.com still, and some of these other things where you're still involved. So you're really seeing kind of, the very beginning of a lot of this, like we call it like the targeted advertising world. We're talking, mid to late 2000s, early 2010s. Talk a little bit about that. Like, again, like we talked a little about the history of the cookie, and maybe give us a little history lesson of, what was it like growing up then? And, the big trends that emerged, and what do you think people should know about some of those trends as we kind of transition into talking more about current day?
Yeah, that's a fascinating world. And I'll also mention before I talk about my opinions that you have a good episode, I think it was from October 27th with Alexi Veneri from Airstrike, who's another Seattle, spent some time in Seattle. But I like that because you talk a bit about the evolution of marketing and how it became very measurable starting in 2010. But I'd like to visit on that a little bit because how do we get to this point where we are today? What I see now, I'm in a very different side of marketing than everything we've talked about so far. And there's a story about how I got there, but let's start with a history lesson about the industry first, and then we can talk about me afterwards. And because you asked about the cookie, and I think if you look at the parallel tracks that the cookie and addressability went on from about the turn of the century till today, and a parallel track at the same time, which was about greater data protection, you come to this collision in 2018 where something was going to have to give. But let's start with the cookie. So the idea of the cookie, and this is a little bit of trivia, the word cookie came from Netscape. There was a 23-year-old engineer named Lou Montulli.
Netscape.
And he needed a way.
I remember that.
Yeah. He needed a way to allow the browser to remember people because it was stateless. And you'd show up and you'd move pages and the browser would forget. So the idea behind the cookie, it used to be called a magic cookie. And the analog here was actually not a chocolate chip cookie like it's oftentimes reported to be. It was actually a fortune cookie. And inside that fortune cookie was a unique identifier that you couldn't see, but it was there, right? So that's where the cookie came from. It was invented as a way to remember you. So, hey, do you have an item in your shopping cart? What's your language preference, right? Those sorts of things. Are you signed in or are not signed in? So a very innocuous approach to it. And then that was in 1994. A year later in 1995, Kevin O'Connor, who was a co-founder of DoubleClick, said there's got to be a commercial application of this cookie. And he and his team began using cookies to follow people between websites because DoubleClick was advertising in so many different places. It could see users across different properties, which had its own appeal for Google when they later acquired DoubleClick. But you have these two gentlemen, you have Lou and you have Kevin. Lou is seeing his invention of the cookie being used and twisted in a way he never intended. Kevin is seeing this great commercial opportunity. Netscape is on the decline and DoubleClick is on the rise. And that was the beginning of the targeting innovations that we've seen over the past 20 years. And that's what led us to this, what's now called today interest-based ads or online behavioral advertising, which is serving ads to people's interests. And in 2007, it got even more interesting with the dawn of the multi-device era with iPhones. So now it's not just cross-site advertising, but it's cross-device, right? Or cross-mobile app, cross-app advertising. And in 2014, you have device graphs that are now not just connecting your PC, right? Your computer and your mobile device, but also connected TV, what you're watching on the big screen. And all of these things create an incredible device graph and make retargeting, right? Retargeting, the idea of remarketing back to someone who has visited a site but hasn't bought a product yet, right? So we have this whole phenomenon of greater and greater hyper targeting happening in the world of the internet. So what else is happening at the same time? Well, there's this other activity going on, this other set of events where you have 2013, Edward Snowden leaking classified information about the NSA surveillance programs. And you have various breaches popping up. So now it's to the drumbeat of almost every week or month there's a major breach. But back then it was making news with Yahoo and Equifax and then Cambridge Analytica. And all of these factors came to a collision point in 2018 where you've got this hyper-targeting and tracking that started with the cookie. And then you've got this data protection rise from these alarming incidents. And that's leading to changing consumer attitudes. And the culmination of that collision was GDPR.
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking.
Right, which which is still regarded as the most comprehensive privacy and security regime because it's a set of things in the world. Now, here we are in the US, probably 2 or 3 years behind that. We're seeing laws from California, from Colorado, Connecticut, Virginia, Utah. But and I'll stop there because there's more history over the past couple years. But I think it's fascinating to really understand where we started in this direction towards hyper-targeting, which ran literally into the brick wall of privacy as regulators started embarking on the greatest simultaneous regulatory change that has ever happened in history, where you've got 75% of the world's population under regulators that are trying to protect data privacy.
It's interesting. I mean, and again, you talked about the reason why even individuals, right? We as people are willing to give it away because of, honestly, it's some of the original intent, right? Which is like, well, gosh, if I don't have to fill out a form or do this, like, yeah, sure, take my personal information. And I think that, a lot of people think that that's what's happening versus some of the things that you're talking about. That I think until you kind of get knee deep in it and understand again that, you're being put into a model and then based on lookalikes for people who have purchased, now I'm going to determine that you should go down that path and I'm going to retarget to you this way. And machines are doing it all, right? And
Yes.
DMPs and through other mechanisms. I think a lot of people, but the interesting part is, why do we continue to trade that, right? We hit accept cookies, right? We say, yeah, we like it. Like, what do you think it's going to take for the US? And obviously we'll get into what you're, kind of doing now too, but just, I'm curious, like, what do you think it's going to take for the US to pass something, And like, I thought for sure when Biden got in that there'd be something in the first 2 years for sure. So what do you think it's going to take for that to happen? Or maybe, like you said, you're seeing these kind of at the state level, but like, how many are people enforcing it? Like, maybe. Because obviously, as you B2B marketer and someone in B2B sales, you're really not seeing a big, shift in how you market or how you engage people.
I think it's going to take a profound experience to really radically change U.S. Attitudes across the board. Although I do think the state by state laws will get us there incrementally. What was different about Europe was that you had real serious data privacy issues dating back to World War II, where your religion and ethnicity was exploited to mortal, tragic outcomes. And that changed the sort of European attitude. In our country, we haven't had that kind of trauma. We've had little things here and there, and it's gotten the attention of some people. But my personal story, I didn't used to give two hoots about privacy until I experienced my own privacy being shared. When you mentioned early on, my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and I started doing all kinds of research on the internet to figure out what are the treatments. And little did I know that while I was visiting those websites, I was being tracked. And then I started receiving all of these ads for shady cancer treatments and dramatic representations of the terminal nature of cancer. And that's the last thing I wanted to see when we were going through this ordeal. And those ads still continued even after my wife passed away. So that completely changed my mind about how data privacy can be, abuse of data privacy can be invasive and hurtful for so many people. But for the collective conscience of the U.S. to change in that regard, I don't know. And I certainly hope we don't experience a trauma that it would take like Europe experienced. But incrementally, you will see this coming from the state level.
Right.
For example, in California, the passing of CCPA and CPRA and the first consent decree against Sephora, where Sephora was fined $1.2 million and under a 2-year injunction, and hundreds of other warning letters were sent out by California. I think we're underestimating the significance of what California is doing right now. And when the CPRA, the more stringent version of that law, takes effect January 1 and enforcement begins July 1, we're going to see a lot more cases like Sephora. Why? Because California takes this seriously. That data privacy is among the highest issues polled in California right now across the political spectrum. It's up there with child trafficking, and because you've got a California Privacy Protection Agency, a mini FTC, which actually has more resources than the FTC does when it comes to privacy enforcement. So you see what's happening in California. and what will happen in California. Colorado's next, with its law taking effect July 1 and having similar provisions to California. Connecticut is also similar to Colorado. And then Virginia and Utah and other states. Like you said, we probably would have expected the Biden administration to do something more sweeping at a national level around privacy. And you ask why that didn't happen. Well, in addition to the sort of collective consciousness not being there and other political issues like Ukraine taking center stage, it's just hard to get things through Congress. We have the ADPPA, which is a national law, but that's not making its way through. And yet California is blazing the trail. And so the states are rising and saying, we don't necessarily need a national law. We don't want to be preempted. We want to take care of our citizens and protect them to a greater degree.
Can you talk? I mean, I want to dive. We'll spend the rest of the time talking about kind of Boltive, and I want you to go deeper on some of this, of like how you came across the aisle and now, what you're up to and the impact that you're having. But, what should people know about some of these laws? And again, like let's talk for our B2B friends out there, maybe, obviously GDPR was interesting. I think people thought it was going to impact B2B a lot more than it has. It has to some extent, but, it hasn't been, I think, as a massive as an impact, I think, that some people thought. But what do you think people need to know about like these laws, again, especially for, someone coming from the B2B marketing world and B2B sales world?
Yeah, I think let's start with California, because I do think they're the 800-pound gorilla in all of this. That if you look at the consent decree with Sephora and the statements by the Attorney General Bonta, it can be almost anybody. The sorts of things that Sephora got in trouble for are in fact common practice among most marketers. And that was a bit of a shock, right? It's not like they pulled an errant case out of left field and made an example of the most extreme version.
Weird fringe case.
Right. It was not a fringe case at all. It's a good word. They took someone who was doing what many other people are doing. The problem with Sephora was they were given a 30-day cure period and they didn't solve the problem in 30 days like most other businesses did that received these warning letters. And that 30-day cure period, by the way, goes away January 1. But it could have been almost anyone. But the things to remember in particular about Sephora, and I'm going to get a little bit technical here because I think this is often missed in the media coverage. So the headlines around that was there's this thing called the GPC, the Global Privacy Control, that California Attorney General's office is requiring all businesses that are doing business in California to honor. And that is a signal that it's today's version of the do not track, where you can turn that on if you're using Firefox or you're using Brave. If you're using Chrome, you may have a browser extension, but it is a flashing light to the internet world that you are opting out of having your data shared. And California is saying you must honor that. Yet 90% plus of US businesses do not honor that. And Sephora was one of them. So that's an important takeaway, that please, like, if you're anywhere doing business in California, get yourself ready to accept the GPC, because that's a layup, and that's an obvious infraction you want to avoid. The second is that the use of third-party data and the difference between sale and share, we may find this counterintuitive, but when California uses the word sale of data, they mean sharing of data for any monetary or other increment of value. Any exchange for value is considered a data sale. And at its face value, you might say, well, we're not selling data to data brokers, we're exempt. That's not true. This can happen to anybody. Getting technical, because you asked about what are the implications for B2B, is, and this is true for B2C also, one of the nuances that is important to understand as a marketer is that this notion of what is sharing data also applies to attribution and measurement. So we all put pixels on web pages to see conversion events. Did someone come to my website from an ad and do some kind of conversion, right? In B2B, it's filling out a form, right? In B2C, it's putting an item in your cart. If you don't understand what you're doing, you can find yourself accidentally, inadvertently violating the law by sharing data. In the case of Sephora, there was an analytics provider widely believed to be Google Analytics that was considered a sale of data, not because that there was an exchange of money, but because that data was being commingled with data from other Google Analytics clients, and then something was then done with that data. Um, you wouldn't consider that a sale in the common language, but in the legal language, that merging of data with others, with data from other sources, is the definition of a share out of
Interesting.
California.
Man, interesting. All right. I was making notes over here. I'm like, okay, well, this is an interesting, kind of new wrinkle here. So yeah, I think it's, look, sometimes I think going into the details is what people need to hear just to really try to understand the nuance of this. And, so they also can protect themselves, and understand like, hey, if you are in California doing business in California, one of these other states, what remedies do I have, or, what should I be thinking about? So let's talk about Boltive. Let's spend the last, 5-10 minutes here going into Boltive. And, you talked a little bit about the genesis of, how to secure advertisers and publishers against invasive media, blocking, malicious, non-compliant, unwanted ads. What do you see? And we're kind of getting into it already, is like the future of this space. You talked about this massive collision that's happened. You've talked about how these worlds are coming together. When you think about what you're doing at Boltive, for those who may know, was formerly Ad Lightning. What's the big thing ahead for you, that you're thinking about as a part of this, and what you're, trying to build with your organization?
So yeah, the company began by finding and blocking malware in advertising. And we discovered that the patents that we had earned on that aspect of the business were quite applicable to the privacy problem too. There's many parallels between malware violations and privacy violations. And one of them that I think we've discovered that isn't yet generally known is that the vulnerability of your third-party vendors is going to come back and surprise you. That's
sure.
what Target and Equifax and Home Depot learned when they had their data breaches. But the same is true with privacy. We find that brands are seeing their what's called the consent signal, the opt-out or the opt-in, when you accept or reject cookies, or when you fill out a form to not have your data shared. That's considered an opt-in, or more often an opt-out when you take that action. That election, that choice, gets mishandled down the vendor chain about half of the time. Not every once in a while, but about half of the time, which means the average US consumer has 100 consent failures per day that they don't even see. That's why we can't shake these ads that are following us around the internet that we think we've opted out of. And so what I think where Boltive comes into that is that we found that vendors and technologies aren't ready for the data privacy regulations, which is unlike anything that's happened before. Usually the regulations are trying to catch up to technology. Now it's the other way around. And so we observe things like dark signals, which I just described, when that consumer choice to opt out is lost. But we also see something which is a little bit more pernicious, which is online skimmers. And let me give you a couple examples. We were working with a global hospitality chain, and their data was leaking to what we later found to be a malware distributor. So that company was able to receive data from the bid stream because they weren't buying ads, but they found a way to buy a seat on a bid exchange. And it actually can get worse than that. There was an issue where it gets to national security implications, where there was an organization called RuTarget, also known as Segmento, which was a subsidiary of Russia's Sberbank. Now, Russia's Sberbank is a sanctioned entity, and the subsidiaries from Sberbank are also sanctioned entities. But for 4 months during the Ukraine invasion, RuTarget and Segmento were receiving data from Google and from other advertisers unknowingly, because there's so many hidden nodes to hide as an ad tech company. This has led presidential decree out of Biden's office to understand the risks of surveillance from foreign governments. And it's led to FTC testimony about this problem. Men and women who serve in the armed forces are also finding themselves under this kind of scrutiny, using and following the tracking of the sites that they browse, their geolocation. So this issue can be quite serious and more than just an annoyance.
Yeah, look at all of the things that are kind of being uncovered with TikTok, right? It's like another
TikTok
example
is a great
of that. Another example of that. And it's like, well, are people going to not? Are they deleting the app? Like, it's, I think it's very interesting, like you said, kind of time that we're going through with all of this, where, it's like we care, we know we care, these things can happen, but yet we're stuck wanting what we perceive as convenience or some other type of experience. So, like what, as you build the company, we were talking a little bit about vision, and one of the episodes that I had done a few months ago, like what does vision mean as a part of this? It's obvious, like, I mean, look, you know more about this than probably 99.9% of the population. So again, I love it. But if I'm taking notes, like that's a good thing. But like when you talk about the vision for the company, like, how do you view that, and what do you feel is, again, kind of the North Star for you and Boltive now?
Yeah, I love that episode you did, and I want to say it was back in September, where you mentioned the North Star and how important that is for empowering teams. That really resonated with me. With Boltive, I feel like we're a step beyond what's considered conscious capitalism. So the idea behind conscious capitalism is that you're a company that makes the world better by reinvesting your profits. So Patagonia will invest in sustainability of the environment. Starbucks will invest in communities and giving grants to disadvantaged folks in those communities. Boltive makes the world better because of what we do every day. So we don't have a whole lot of profits, right? We're a startup. But by finding and stopping invasive media, whether it's malware or whether it's privacy violations, this is stuff that's not just annoying, as I hope you're getting from my stories here, but it's also corrosive and predatory. But yet it's extraordinarily lucrative without any policing of it. And you describe the algorithms and the machines that are guiding what's called a real-time bidding, which takes place in 10 to 20 milliseconds for all of us when we visit websites. Extraordinarily lucrative. And the more data you have about somebody, the more money you're going to make. But companies hire us to be the sheriff. And having that as our core, having this mission of making the internet safer, does give a sense of intrinsic benefit that when we do our employee surveys is important to the people that work at Boltive. And it's important to me in what I get up and what fires me up every morning to bring our best.
Yeah. I think it's exciting. I think this is a topic where it's starting to become more and more prevalent. But again, I think, it's just a good, hopefully for a lot of people listening, either introduction or maybe thought-provoking around, like, so when you see an article about, like, let's just say TikTok, for example, or some of these others, like, okay, well, now at least I'm conscious about what's happening, and I can kind of, make decisions for myself on, what I want to do, how I want to participate, and just to understand that that's not just happening on TikTok. That's happening, as you mentioned, right, on some of the largest sites that you can imagine, where you're being cookied and remembered, and paywalled or not paywalled, or fed an ad or not fed an ad. As we start to kind of wrap up, like, and again, I think we've already talked a little bit about the future and, kind of your vision for the company. What's next on the horizon? And I would two-part question here, both for you at Boltive and how you take this to the next level, and then for those of us who are consumers, the things that we need to continue to, be more aware of.
Yeah. Well, for us, on our roadmap, we've launched our product Privacy Guard, which is secret shoppers for privacy. So we go through customer journeys and we identify where are the vulnerabilities. It's like a smoke test for internet pipes. We identify where the leaks are. So the secret shoppers for privacy. We're also developing, for lack of a better term, secret agents for privacy, which actually intervene and stop the data in the moment, not just identify it and report it, but actually remediate it and stop it in the moment, which is extraordinarily valuable. So that's where we're going as a company, is in addition to developing more intelligent ways like machine learning of identifying malware in internet ads. But I think if we look at the future, marketing, we started a bit with the history of marketing. Marketing has long sought to optimize reach and frequency and other efficiency and hyper-targeting methods. Well, now it's going to have to optimize for privacy. People who buy or sell ads can't operate in the way they have for the past 20 years. And it's not just buying or selling ads, people that are sharing data, tags and pixels on pages, attribution, measurement, analytics. All of these things we've taken for granted are now under a new frame of enforcement. And consumers get a vote now on whether they want to share their data. I think privacy first today is like mobile first was 10 years ago. So that's one thing to be aware of, is the consumer's changing. And we may lament that marketing isn't going to be as good as it was in the past when the targeting was more precise. But we got to remember, consumers have been clearing cookies for years, and they've been increasingly hiding their tracks and putting in ad blockers and all kinds of things. The path that marketing was going down was not sustainable. And we can't just blame the regulators for putting us in the position we were. We did it to ourselves. I was one of them in my former career, right? So I think that's a thing. But we don't want regulations to go too far, because there's a positive future here where consumers can make their own trade-offs between how much privacy and how much convenience they want in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a negative future where if we go too far and too draconian, we could find us back to the way the internet was at the beginning of the era, kind of in the last century. That's back where we had the walled gardens of AOL and CompuServe, which was a viable model, but very antithetical to the open web that we're used to. If we go too far and we put too many regulations down, only the big tech companies, only FANG are going to survive, because it's going to be too expensive for small businesses to keep up. So I think there are limits to how far we want regulations to go, but I think there's also a role for companies like Boltive, where the technologies can make simple privacy protection outside the scope of big tech and reduce the manual burden. So that's another thing that we're in service, is to help level the playing field from a privacy standpoint, so the walled gardens don't come back.
Yes, I don't think anybody wants that. But what I think what you mentioned is spot on, which is, this new world is a world where we choose versus it's chosen for us, right? Whereas like your privacy and like the control you have over it, you have, like more levers to pull. Whereas now it's kind of a, either opt in, opt out. And then again, the people, even when you're opting out, it's so leaky that, 50% of the time it doesn't even matter. And so I hope everyone listening, has had a ton of takeaways. Like I said, I literally have like a page of notes now of different like rabbit holes that I'm going to go down now after this. And Dan, I think we should just do a whole episode just talking about this, like California, the CPRA. I'm very fascinated about this. So for anyone who wants to really nerd out with us, we might do a follow-up episode on just that. So, but Dan, big thank you for joining, sharing your story. Like I said, I know I had a bunch of takeaways. I'm sure my listeners did as well.
Yeah. And thank you, Jake, for having me on the show. If anybody wants to talk further about this, I do geek out on privacy. You can reach me at my email's dan@boltive.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn, Dan Frechtling. I would love to connect.
Love it. And we'll put all those links in the show notes as well, too. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. And we will see you next week on the Jake Dunlap Show. Thank you, everyone, again for listening to another episode. If you are listening all the way to the end, I hope you have left a review. I hope that you make sure that you're following or subscribing on your favorite podcast listening apparatus. We'll be back next Thursday. And again, make sure to check out the Monday episodes as well, too. A lot of people are really enjoying these kind of mini episode Mondays. So make sure to tune in, subscribe, and leave a review.